you for coming after lunch. I know the after lunch slide's always usually pretty rough. I get sleepy as well, so I really appreciate everyone attending my talk. I'm Huyen Dao. I'm an Android developer, and I'm here to discuss navigating to the navigation component. So what is the navigation component? Well, it's one of those new Jetpacky things that was announced this year at I/O 2018. And it is, again, kind of one of those new, Google has an opinion on how to do something because you asked us so much what our opinion is. And this is some of their opinions on navigation. So what I'd actually like to do with you today is take you through an example of moving an application that kind of is using kind of more, let's call them traditional navigation patterns, and then seeing what we can do with them in the new navigation architecture component. But before we get to that, let's talk about some of these opinionated principles that Google is kind of now sharing with us. And it's kind of interesting where their opinions are going, and kind of you can kind of see like the threads of us complaining, or users complaining over the years with Android navigation, and kind of seeing where they're trying to go with it to solve these problems. So number one principle of the new navigation component is that apps should have a fixed starting destination. So what this really means, if you can read it, is that there's going to be a single screen that your user is going to see, which is going to be the first thing that your user sees when they enter your app, and it's going to be the last thing that they see once they kind of back all the way out. So there is a fixed starting destination. The second principle of the new kind of navigation component is about the navigation stack. So this is not actually that much different. So an app's navigation stack is basically a stack that is last in, first out, and the bottom of that stack is always going to be the starting destination, that first screen in and that last screen that your user sees out. And the top of that stack is always going to be the current screen that your user is on. So nothing too crazy. Now here's something pretty interesting. In the new navigation principles, up and back are equivalent within your own task. Now I personally have always been the one who's been telling everyone that, oh, up and back is different. It's just like, breadcrumbs versus the back button on your browser. And I've written long essays and comments about why we should be adhering to this. And now Google's telling me that, oh no, they're the same. But basically within your own task, within your own application, up and back should basically function the same. The only exception is that starting destination, where up doesn't really exist because it's the first screen, so up doesn't really make any sense, and back will basically take you, or rather your users, out of the app. Now the exception to this is if your activity is part of another app's task. So when does this happen? So if you think about that share screen that comes up, and where you can kind of hit the share screen, the bottom sheet comes up, and you can select some other application to share content with, that whatever that lucky individual app that you picked to share content with, the activity that pops up is actually running in that original app's task. So in that case, back will exit out of that activity that got borrowed back out, and up will allow the user to kind of go up in the hierarchy of that kind of borrowed app in that activity. And if you kind of want a little more better explanation of it, there's a really great talk by Dan Galpin and Lila Fujiwara of Google called Adventures in Navigation. And they go into actually a lot of more kind of advanced stuff that will be kind of more advanced than what we're going to be talking about today. And finally, deep linking. So the final principle of kind of the new navigation component is about deep linking. And so basically, when you are either deep linking or navigating kind of in a regular way to a destination within your app, both backstacks should be the same. So basically, regardless however you get to a destination, you should allow the user to kind of up and back, however they choose, back to the start destination. And what's really interesting is that when you deep link, what happens is the existing backstack that was there from whatever the user did previously is destroyed and is replaced with the deep links navigation stack. To be honest with you, I've heard some kind of not conflicting, but a little bit different opinions from Google about what exactly the same backstack means, but that's the general principle. All right, so those are principles. Why do we care? Why do we have to switch to a new navigation component? And if you're like me, you might have heard a lot that this is kind of centered around single activity, lots of fragments. And depending on your comfort level or your level of fury at fragments, you may like this, you may not. But there are actually very good things about this navigation component. Number one is consistency. And when I mean consistency of navigation both within your app and within the apps on the platform. I feel like in general, Google having an opinion and these kind of precepts and also components that exercise these precepts are going to be good for us as kind of developers of apps to make sure that our navigation, depending on wherever we go in our app, is consistent, but that also a user kind of navigating one app will have a familiar experience on another app, just kind of making that kind of user experience overall on the platform better. Another really great thing about the navigation components are actually less boilerplate and less error-prone code. So all those things that we complain about the last 10 years of doing Android, fragment transactions, starting activities, all that kind of like messy but necessary but not too bad code actually gets extracted away quite a bit in the new navigation component, and you start kind of expressing navigation in kind of higher level concepts, navigating here, navigating there. And again, it kind of makes it a little less work for you, a little less code to type, and a little less error prone. And along the lines of less boilerplate, one of the nice things about the navigation component is that it is a proud recipient of some really awesome Ktx extensions, which just basically, again, kind of make the syntax a little nicer, a little bit cleaner. And something that I actually really like and that has been kind of added. I generally am not a WYSIWYG person, but I've kind of fallen into it in the last couple years with constraint layout and everything else. But with the new navigation editor, we now have a visual map of what is going on in our applications. And this, I remember like when I first got to my current job at Trello, I spent the first week mapping out screens because we had just so many screens. I didn't know what went to where and where did this screen come from. I actually sat down with like OmniGraffle or something and spent like a week trying to figure it out. And it was great. Everyone loved it. And it was basically obsolete within 2 months. And no one has updated it since because we all actually have code to write. But imagine now with this navigation editor, we have not just a visual tool that allows us to implement navigation, quicker, but also just a really handy, visual documentation of the screens in your app, how you get there, and something that's kind of just a really easy way to onboard new folks in your team. So kind of double win in terms of implementation and documentation. And finally, easier testing. I can't get into this too much now, but I know us Android folks love to make sure that our apps are easily testable. And a lot of the kind of new navigation components lend themselves fairly well to kind of mocking and being able to actually properly test some of the navigation flows. So, all right, enough principles and abstractions. What does this actually look like? Oh, and by the way, I know that I had this reaction too when navigation component first came out. Am I actually going to be rewriting my entire application to a single activity and multiple fragments? Kind of, yes. So there's not really any way you can get away from the idea of single activity with multiple fragments within the navigation component, but it's not like your entire application will be one activity. There's actually concepts of breaking up your entire, say, navigation flow within your application as a whole into kind of subgraphs and subflows. So if you're kind of like me and have been kind of working at work on modularizing your code, trying to break up features in different modules, this actually lends itself very well. So yes, you do have to use fragments, and you'll see why in a second why it's kind of integral to the component, but it's not like, oh my gosh, everything's going to be folded down to one activity. There is kind of some leeway and there is some modularity there that you can work with. So for the purposes of this application, I made a little test app. It's a photo app. I just pulled some really nice photos from Unsplash of some cities I visited in the last 6 months. And so I go from a collection of kind of photos related to a city to a list of the photos that were taken in that city to a view where I can see slightly bigger the photo that I've selected. So I have 3 activities and a backstack that kind of goes up, up, and up from the collections to the photo list to an individual photo. And if I want to take a look really quickly about how that's implemented, I start off with my photo collection activity. It's my launcher, and just kind of to make it easier for this example to kind of roll into navigation components, each activity has a fragment that is holding the actual list. So pretty much everything is a list of photos minus the last screen, but everything is an activity with a fragment inside and looks something like this, where at the beginning in onCreate, I have some fragment transaction where I'm instantiating a fragment, sticking in arguments in it sometimes, and then going ahead and adding that to my activity. And in terms of the navigation, I have a bunch of recycler views, and I kind of navigate around based on clicks. So if I open up one of these recycler views, or one of these adapters for my recycler view. So here's my adapter. It looks pretty typical. I've got my creating a view holder, binding view holder, and the part where I do the navigation in each of these recycler views to kind of get to the more kind of specific screen is right here. So I'm binding some data object of some type, a collection, a photo list, or an individual photo. And then what I do is I add a click listener onto the item view. And inside of that, I kind of use whatever data I'm binding to determine what screen I'm going to next, call context.startActivity, and let the activity fly. And that's pretty much it. So what can navigation component do with this? Or what is it going to look like as we move towards navigation component? So there's a lot going on with the navigation component. There's I think 2 or 3 classes that are pretty central. So something that's really interesting is kind of going with that navigation editor, that really nice kind of visual layout of our views, is this new resource. It's a navigation resource. And what I do is if I want to use the navigation component, I'm going to create a new Android resource file. And there is a resource type called navigation. And I'm going to name my navigation resource something like navigation photo. And that will create a navigation resource. Oh. But the first thing you should be doing is adding a dependency. So I'm going to go ahead and let this add the dependency. I'm going to open up my, yes, please go ahead and add it. Oh, 1 second. Let me open up my build Gradle file. And inside of the app, I'm going to add the, let's see, nav dependency, or is it dependency? App dependency. Come on, little live. Dependency, or is it dependency dot navigation? All right. So there's a dependency. So because the application, the navigation components are kind of centered around fragments, there is a dependency called, here we go, navigation.fragment. And also something to be really kind of aware of is that the navigation component is in alpha, so APIs are likely to change, things are likely to be broken. They were broken in the kind of process of writing this talk. But what you want to do is to get kind of your hands on the Android navigation components is to add this dependency. Now, if you're using Kotlin, what you can do is you can actually add -ktx to the artifact ID, and that will give you not only the navigation component, but also kind of all that nice kind of Ktx Kotlin extensions with it. So I'm going to sync Gradle. Oh no, I'm offline. Let me go ahead and go back offline. Go back online and download my dependencies. So this fragment, this navigation fragment is going to contain kind of the dependencies I need to build out my navigation graph. There we go. And so the way that this navigation graph works is that anything in your navigation graph is going to be kind of mostly one of 2 things. There's going to be destinations and there's going to be actions. Destinations are basically the screens in your application that your user can go kind of navigate to. And actions are basically how they get there. And so you build this graph connecting destinations and actions. Now there's a thing called a Nav Host, which is kind of one of the, I guess, managers or kind of one of the gatekeepers to the navigation component. And the Nav Host is going to live inside of our inside of our activity. So if I open up my activity, starting destination. So this is my original activity. There's not much to it. It was just a container for me to swip in a fragment. So what I'm going to do to start kind of navigation componentizing my application is to add the Nav Host Fragment. So I could do this programmatically, but right now I'm using a tag. There's a fragment tag. I actually haven't done this in years, but I actually find this is kind of the easiest way to do this. And the class is actually this Nav Host Fragment. Now Nav Host is a interface, and basically what a Nav Host does is a couple of things. First, it associates something called a Nav controller with a view, and it also kind of takes care of handling state. So there's a lot of state going on when we navigate, right, with the backstack. So the Nav Host actually kind of also helps the navigation controller kind of save and restore state. And the Nav Host Fragment in particular, this particular implementation of Nav Host is itself a Nav Host, but also kind of a container for content. So that Nav Host Fragment is going to be the kind of content area. Anything that you're navigating to, whatever screens you're navigating kind of across as you go through your application, are going to live inside of this Nav Host Fragment. So there's a couple of interesting attributes here. The first is default nav host. Now, what this means is that this particular nav host is going to be able to respond to the back button. And at first I asked myself, well, why would you ever need more than one of these? But it actually is possible to have nav host fragments nested in each other. And if you kind of do that, you generally probably want one of them in control of the back button. So that's what that's for. But generally, I've only ever used kind of one nav host fragment so far, and so that one gets true. And the really important part here is adding the host nav graph. So the host nav graph is kind of that navigation graph, that kind of mapping of destinations and how do I get to those destinations via actions. That is going to be kind of what the navigation controller moves our user to as they interact with our application. So I'm going to hand it a navigation resource, and that's it. So now I've basically established a host fragment where my kind of navigable content will live, and I've going to go ahead, go back to my activity. Oh, yeah, live templates. And actually, let me go ahead and open up photo collection fragment. All right. So here's my photo collection fragment. It is going to become my starting destination. It's that initial screen with all of the different collections of photo lists. And now that I have a photo host and, or rather a nav host fragment, which is now showing up inside of my navigation graph, I can start adding destinations. So the first thing I said I wanted to do was to take my photo collection, oh dear, photo, create a new destination, is to, live coding is fun. Is to add a fragment. Let me go see if it's one more time. So normally what happens is when you have fragments that you can kind of navigate to, they show up in the suggestion list. But what I'm going to do here is just going to go ahead and see if I can type it out. So I have a fragment, and there's different kinds of destinations that you can have inside of your navigation graph. You can generally make fragments destinations, activities can be destinations, other graphs can be destinations, and you can actually create your own custom navigations or navigation destinations. Sorry, it's a module. I mean, comment. Ah, thank you. So that's what's going on. So if I move my navigation graph to the right spot, let's go over here. Right. All right. So we're going to remake this. Delete anyway. Okay. So remake my navigation component. Okay, there we go. All right, now that I'm actually in my app module, I should be able to pull up the photo collection fragment. All right, so usually what happens is the first destination that you put into your navigation graph is going to be your kind of starting destination, and you can start adding kind of your other destinations. I'll add a my photo list fragment, and my photo detail fragment. All right, so all of these fragments are going to be destinations, places that I can navigate to within my navigation controller. And here we go. So these are my destinations. Now, actions are going to be links between these destinations. And I can really easily create an action by just dragging from one destination to another. And if you're not really a WYSIWYG person, which I know I used to not be, you can still go into XML and easily edit this. Something interesting to note is that actions live within their source destinations, generally speaking. So here you can see my photo collection fragment, and to navigate away from that, I have an action inside that will navigate to my photo list fragment. So there's a couple things to note. When you're using the navigation component, generally what's going to happen is you're going to be working with IDs a lot. r.id.something something. And kind of a good practice here is to change these IDs. When you drag them into the WYSIWYG, they'll generally take an ID that's equal to like the name of that fragment. But I believe a lot of the team has suggested doing something like this, where you prefix it with destination and then actually give it kind of a proper name that allows you to distinguish the ID of a destination versus the ID of something else. So we're going to go ahead and, yes, change that. And destination photo list. Yes, and then change that as well to destination photo detail. All right. Now, there's actually a lot of really interesting attributes in both the WYSIWYG and the XML, and all of this is, again, is just trying to kind of make it easier and like a little bit less, add a little bit less friction to not just kind of connecting navigable destinations, but adding transitions, things like that. So if I click on this action, there's actually quite a bit of things that I can do. I can add transitions, I can add some pop behavior, even some launch options. But we're going to hold on that for just a second. Now, when I make the navigation graph, really all I'm doing is specifying, in a sense, and pun not intended, intents. I'm specifying places that my user can go and ways that they can get there. But I actually haven't hooked this up into the UI just yet. To do that, I'm going to go into my fragment, my photo collection fragment. So, and then actually I'm going to go into my photo collection adapter. Okay, so this is where I would actually, that kind of point of navigation that I had before, the item click listener. So in order to navigate using the navigation component, I have to call upon that wonderful navigation controller, which is kind of like the manager, the one that actually drives the navigation and does all that dirty work. So fragment transactions, starting activities, the navigation controller kind of takes all of that, takes charge of doing all that dirty work and just gives you a really nice, relatively nice API to call on. So to do that from here, instead of kind of directly calling start activity, I'm going to grab my navigation controller, and there's a few ways of doing that. You can grab the navigation controller from a view, from a fragment, from an activity, and with a little bit of Kotlin Ktx magic, you get these really nice extension functions that kind of tidy up the syntax a little bit. So what I'm saying is, okay, I have a view here, and it's living, presumably it's living inside of some kind of nav host. So I want to get the nav controller kind of associated with that navigation graph and navigation host, and I'm going to navigate using that controller. So when you navigate, there's actually quite a few overloads for this, and there's a lot of ways for you to specify where you want to go. You can specify a destination in particular. So if you give the destination an ID, you can just say, hey, I want to go to destination _ this. If you have an action, usually actions also have IDs, you can specify the ID of a specific action that you want to kind of follow, and wherever they end up is where the user ends up. So there's a lot of different options here. To start off with, I'm just going to go ahead and do r.id, destination photo list. So I want to go from a collection to displaying all the photos in that collection. So I'm going to navigate to the destination photo list, and I'm not quite done there. So if I open up my photo list fragment, I actually have several arguments that I'm requiring. So I have kind of a very familiar fragment factory. I have some arguments coming into that fragment factory, and I'm kind of doing a bunch of preconditions checking and all kinds of this stuff to get the arguments that I passed in when I created the fragment out later when I'm actually creating views and doing all that lovely fragment stuff. So I need arguments. How do I do that with the navigation architecture components? Well, if I go back to my adapter, what I can do is look at some of these some of the navigate overrides, and it actually allows you to specify a bundle, and that bundle will become the arguments of your fragment. So if I do bundle of, thanks to KTX, I can go ahead and grab the key from the photo list fragment, and this is going to look really ugly for now, but I have my keys that are keyed into my argument bundle, and I'm going to go ahead and specify some values for them. So I'm going to grab that collection ID from the data that I just bound above, and I think I also set that I could kind of change the number of columns. So let me go ahead and just throw, let's see, photo list fragment dot column count to, let's say, 3. All right, so now I specified some arguments for my fragment. I've given it a specific collection ID to show, and I've also kind of changed around the number of columns that I want to display in my grid. And one other thing that you have to be careful with, which I was not, is that you have to be really careful when you're mixing navigation component with fragment transactions. In fact, I generally say that you should probably not be using fragment transactions if you're going to be using the navigation component. So here, in my original kind of surrounding activity, I have this transaction, and it took me a couple times to realize that I was actually kind of destroying the Nav Host fragment that I had specified in the layout. So again, it's probably not a good idea to mix fragment transactions with navigation components unless you're really, really careful. And I think that's all we need. I'm going to give it a run and see what we have. So rather than specifically starting activities from my kind of photo collection adapter, I'm saying, hey, navigation controller, do you remember that destination that I specified? Well, please take me to there and pass along these arguments. And hopefully if I click on this, there we go. I have, my photo list, and it is kind of responding to the navigation. So if I go back and look at my photo collection adapter, there's a couple of things that could be done better here. So one of the, I think, tricky things about fragments is the arguments. So the arguments is a bundle. It's pretty kind of loose. There's no real type checking there, right? I mean, I know that I personally have many times like missed arguments or put in the wrong type into an argument and tried to pull it out the other side and just gotten crashes and exceptions. So navigation component actually has a plugin that helps you do that. And part of this kind of abstracting navigation, trying to make it more consistent, is in fact trying to make this kind of like this argument passing a little bit safer. So there's actually a plugin called Safe Args, and to add it in, we can go back to first our project Gradle file, and we can add in the class path for Safe Args, which which kind of gives us access to the plugin, and then we're going to go to the app build file and add in the Safe Args plugin. So what this Safe Args plugin does is it actually takes a look at your navigation graph and is able to generate some helper classes that allow you to kind of create pass arguments and retrieve them safely. And Safe Arg actually works off of your navigation resource right here. And what you can do is say, okay, here's my destination, my photo list. As you can see here in the WYSIWYG, I've got a little kind of arguments section. And if I start clicking on it, it actually gives me a window where I can specify arguments. And now these are the exact same arguments that you would normally pass to a fragment. So if I want to say pass in a collection ID, and I know what type it's going to be, it would be an integer. And then I don't want to set a default value because I want this to be a required argument. So I'm going to leave a default value out. And if you're, again, more of an XML person, you can certainly do this in XML. I'm going to add in one more argument. That is the column count. And then I'm going to have, and the argument type is an integer as well. And there we go. So this is basically, by me adding these argument tags inside this fragment, I'm letting the navigation controller and Safe Args know that, hey, this fragment takes these arguments. And I'm actually going to set a default value on these two. So I have one required argument and one optional argument. And I'm actually going to rebuild my project just to make sure that Safe Args has a chance to generate these classes. Go, NeonCat, go. And I'm going to go ahead and go back to my collection adapter. So there's two places where Safe Args comes in. Inserting arguments into our fragments and then pulling them back out. So if I go back here, now instead of actually using a destination ID to navigate, I would kind of prefer actually to use my actions. Because again, these actions define very specific routes that my users can go to get from place to place. So I would actually rather prefer not just to kind of, to get away from the ambiguity of the ID and the kind of like the error proneness of IDs and kind of pull out a proper object that allows me to pull out the arguments in a type safe way. So if I go ahead and start typing directions. So this is the class that Safe Args generates. It's generally the name of the fragment class, or the name of the fragment class plus the word directions. And it has, it will generate for each action from that fragment this method with this very unfortunate name. But it's the action to go from the photo collection fragment to the photo list fragment. And it actually is able to look at those argument tags and say, okay, you specified one required argument, the collection ID, so that becomes a parameter into that function. And so I can go ahead and actually put in my collection ID in this action instead. And this actually returns an action that encapsulates both this kind of navigation and my arguments into it. So instead of doing all this jazz with navigating to an ID and adding in a bundle, I just do that. And if you're wondering, oh, well, what about that kind of, what about the kind of optional arguments? You can always go into the action, and for default arguments, it does have a setter. So if I set my column count to something like 5, and then navigate to action, and oh, I never got rid of that. And there. So instead of saying doing all this like very kind of low level start the activity, I actually have now said, all right, navigation controller, navigate using this action. And again, instead of having to worry about, am I finding the right key? Am I making sure that, am I hoping, praying that I have all the right arguments? I just let safe args do it for me. And then on the flip side, inside of my photo list fragment, you can see here, all right, I'm doing kind of the typical stuff to get arguments out of the fragment bundle. I'm doing some preconditions checking. I've got some default values. It's kind of ugly and, again, not very secure. But as a kind of like pair to my something something class directions, there is the destination args. And again, this is a class that safe args has generated, and it allows me to just take the argument bundle, pass it in, and then from that kind of args object, I can pull out my column count and my collection ID. And as you can see, it's just a lot nicer, cleaner, and more kind of direct way of accessing these arguments. And if I go ahead and run that, nancat go, and see what we get. It should just work. Just work, as long as the app runs. And so here I am using my new kind of arguments and using kind of like the safe args. I can, again, kind of manipulate and just have like the navigation work easily with fragments. And what was really nice is that I actually didn't call new instance. I don't need these constants anymore. I can just rely on navigation component to do all that kind of nasty stuff for me. Now, something you might have noticed that is missing that I had before is the up back button here. Now, something that's really, really nice about navigation components is that it not just tries to abstract away all that kind of messy fragment transactions and activity starting. It will actually hook into navigation UI for you and use that navigation graph to populate those navigation UI components. So if I go to my app Gradle file and I add another dependency, this time it's navigation UI Ktx 1.0 alpha. And if I go ahead and actually I'm going to switch a little bit. Actually, see. So if I go to my activity, photo collection activity. All right, so here I actually have kind of like something very familiar. I'm setting up a support action bar and I'm passing in a toolbar. Rather than doing this, I can do something like this code. All right. So what's really, really nice about all this is that, again, it's kind of abstracting away a lot of this work of setting up the navigation controller and replacing it with nice objects and a nice API. So what I'm doing here inside of my activity that is hosting all of this navigation stuff is I'm pulling out the nav controller. And that nav controller, again, has a navigation graph, this set of destinations and actions associated with it. And then I'm actually saying, OK, I want you to create an app bar based on the destinations and the kind of hierarchy described by that graph. And then I'm going to grab a reference to a toolbar, and then I can call this really nice set up with nav controller method, and I pass it in the nav controller. I pass it in an app bar configuration, and if I run this, again, so what that actually is going to do is populate, or not really populate, but kind of do the job of all of that nonsense of support action bar, set display home enabled, set display home as up. It takes care of all that for me, and if I navigate in, I see, oh, hey, look, I've got a little up and back button, and it works perfectly. No kind of specifying, you know, like all this and all that. You just rely on the navigation graph and kind of all that specification to take care of it for you. There's a lot going on in navigation components that are really great. And just to kind of, let me see, get reset hard, just to show you what it looks like. And what's kind of amazing is that as I started making this like example, I really found that I could delete a lot of that really old code. So after, let's see. So just to show you what it looks like, after I hooked up all of the rest of my components and everything like that, I was able to delete 2 of my activities, and now my photo collections fragment doesn't need all of those constants, doesn't need the factory, and same thing with all my kind of other fragments as well. They're just these really neat, kind of really clean classes. So something else that is really interesting in navigation component is that now, for example, deep links are kind of first-class citizens. If you've ever had to do a deep link, you kind of realize how nasty it is with writing intent filters. But you can do it really, really easily with the navigation component. So if I open up my deep link branch, let's see out there, And let me go ahead and rebuild everything. So what's really cool about deep links is that you no longer have to declare the intention filter yourself in the Android manifest. You actually kind of just add some magic to the navigation graph, add a couple of things to the Android manifest, and in kind of like the final APK, it does actually generate that intent filter for you, but you get to write some much nicer code. So to actually specify a deep link now, I can go to my navigation graph and look in the editor, and you can see here. So say I wanted people to be able to deep link right directly to, I can do something like this, and as you see, I have a little link, and there's a little kind of accompanying attribute in the UI, and what I have here is just this deep link tag, and I can still use placeholders in order to kind of specify, like, kind of for matching, and also for pulling out arguments from that URL. And what I get in my Android manifest is something like this, where I actually just go ahead and specify a navigation graph to associate, again, with that activity. And something I discovered, which, again, because things are alpha, is that you also have to add in this new intent handling, and you pass off kind of any new intents that come in, and pass it off to the controller so that it can kind of do the nice routing. And if I run this and get the right ADB command, there we go. So what I'm going to do now is kind of simulate passing in a URL that has like a photo ID as that kind of last part of the URI. And if I go ahead and run this, I have linked directly to a photo. And it doesn't matter where I am in the hierarchy. If I just have it handle that URI, it goes directly to that. And that was just done with a few tags of code, all high level. And it's all just, again, kind of naturally part of the fragments. So just another kind of example of things that are just made better. And so, like, navigation component, it has a lot of rough edges. It's an alpha. I feel like some of the APIs are still kind of being worked through, and I think all the time people are finding cases that the Android team has yet to handle. But if any of this is interesting to you, if you find fragment transactions like intolerable, if you're kind of tired of writing start activity everywhere, if you found yourself writing a navigation controller or URI handler, which I think we're talking about at work, so I might have to talk to them about this navigation component, you should definitely look at it. It's definitely worth working. And again, kind of moving towards opinionated, more consistent ways of doing things, and kind of abstracting away all the dirty work and being able to write higher level code is kind of what this is all about. So I definitely encourage you to try it. There's so many different things you can do, like linking to subgraphs, creating your own custom destinations. And I think as part of making this better, it's kind of our job to kind of play around with it, see what we like, what we don't like, and give that feedback, because again, it's an alpha. So that's kind of what I have for you today on the navigation component, and just kind of show you just like, how relatively, a little bit painful, but relatively painless compared to fragment transactions it can be to navigate over to the navigation component. And thank you very, very much.